Hello everyone and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Marios and today we'll be talking about scope. Scope is an important concept in all programming languages and each language has its own ideas around it. Our main topic today will be scope in JavaScript and the first step will be to understand variables declaration. There are three main keywords which we can use to declare variables and we will discuss them in a moment. Then we will explore how variables declared with different keywords affect block and function scope. And lastly, we will be talking about lexical environments. Lexical environments is an advanced concept in JavaScript, however, essential to fully understand how the JavaScript engine works internally to manage scope. There are three main keywords which we can use to declare a variable, and those are var, let, and const. Before ECMAScript 2015, var was the default way on how we set a variable, but since then, developers they moved away from it and they start using the let and const declaration. The main reason is that let and const they have a block scope in contrast with var, which has a function scope. If you're wondering what's the difference between let and const, so const sets an immutable variable, meaning that we are not able to update the value that we set to it. And let allow us to update the value that we have already allocated. If we test this, so we can set a variable with the name and set the value of John, and if we console log the output, we get the value of name. If we try to update the value of the variable manually and set the value to DOE, we see that we get the expected output. However, if we use the const declaration, we see that we get an error, and this is because we are not able to update the value of it. The same behavior as let has var, so we are able to mutate the variable that we set, but as we discussed, let and var, they have different scope. If we could give a definition to scope, this would be the area within a script that variables are available to the engine. What we need to understand now is that using different keywords, we can set a different scope, and there are two main scopes available in JavaScript, and those are function and block scope. Knowing those two types of scope can be important, but to really understand how the engine behaves, we need to understand lexical environments. A lexical environment is an object with two parts within it. The first part will be an environment record, which is an object with the variables locally declared within a certain piece of logic. And the second part will be a reference to an outer lexical environment. So let's understand what we mean lexical environment by showing a few examples. The top level script in JavaScript is wrapped within an immediate for function expression. And this means that this script is called within a function. Knowing that var has a function scope, this will trigger the creation of a lexical environment, and the same applies for let and const, which inherits the benefits of var declaration. If we try to understand how the engine works using the var keyword, then when the function is invoked, it will create a lexical environment and it will look all the var declarations within the script. So in that case, it will set the variable of name and the value of John, and then it starts moving and passing each line of the script. When it reaches to line 8, then it sees that the variable has already been set, and then move into the line 9, and in that case it needs to update the lexical environment. So it will update the variable of name and set the value to DOE, and when it reaches to line 10, it will print the value of DOE. In the case of let and const, the engine will set an empty lexical environment at the top, and when it reaches to line 8, then it will populate the lexical environment with the variable of name and the value of John. And then when it reaches to line 9, it will update the lexical environment to include the value of DOE. And when it reaches to line 10, it prints the value of DOE. To show the difference between each keyword, we need to update our example. So when I said block, I mean curly braces, and when we use block in JavaScript, this triggers a new lexical environment in let and const declaration. This is not the case for var, since we have already said that it triggers a function scope. So if we use an if statement and we want to enter that statement, so we set a variable of name, and here I'm gonna set it to John. I want to console log the variable and also console log the variable at the bottom. So I will remove the previous script that we have, and we see here we get the within the if statement we get the value of John, but when we exit and reach line 13 we get an empty string. This is because the engine, when it starts, it creates an empty lexical environment, and curly braces, they trigger a new lexical environment. So when it enters the if statement, the engine will create a new lexical environment. So in that case, we will have the variable of name and the value of John, and these would have a pointer to an outer lexical environment, which in that case would be the global lexical environment, and it's empty. When we console log the value of name here, we get the value of John because the engine, it looks on the first lexical environment, finds the variable of name, and returns the value of John. When it exits the if statement, this lexical environment is not available anymore and it's garbage collected. And in line 13, when it looks for the variable of name, it would look on the empty lexical environment, and in that case, it doesn't include the variable of name. When we update our keyword to use the var declaration, we see that we get, in both cases, the value of John, and this is because we are not triggering a new lexical environment within the if statement. So if we try to understand this one, the name of John will be assigned at the top of the script, and when we enter the if statement, we won't be creating a new lexical environment, and we will be using the global lexical environment. So we already know that the global lexical environment has the variable of name and the value of John, and when we console log the value, it looks on the global lexical environment. When we move outside the if statement and then look again for the variable of name, it would check the global lexical environment, and in both cases it print the value of John. Another common example is when we use a for loop. So let's say that we want to iterate until we reach the value of 10, and I will use the var declaration, set the variable of index, and iterate until I reach the value of 10. Increment this value in each iteration, and I want to execute that code asynchronously, so I will be using a set timeout. So I want to console log the index, and I would set a delay of 0. If we see our output at the bottom, in all 10 cases we get the value of 10, and that's because the var declaration doesn't trigger a new lexical environment. So when we initially call the script, the JavaScript engine will set the variable of index and set the value of 0, and in each iteration the engine will update the value of index within the global lexical environment. So on the first iteration, it will update it to 1, on the second to 2, and on the third to 3, and it will keep doing it until to reach the value of 10. So since we call that function asynchronously, then it will look on the latest value that we have set in the index, and for that reason, it prints the value of 10. To fix this issue, we need to use the let declaration, and using let, we are able to create a new lexical environment in each iteration, and this allows us to decouple the lexical environment of each iteration. When we call the script, then it will set an empty lexical environment, which will be the global lexical environment, and in each iteration, it will trigger a new lexical environment. So the lexical environment will include the variable of index and the value of 0. And when we call the function here, so the engine will also create a new lexical environment. So that lexical environment will be empty because we are not assigning any variable. It will point to an outer lexical environment, which in that case would be the nearest lexical environment, which is index with the value of 0. And it will also point to an outer lexical environment, which in that case would be the global one. When the right time comes to print the value, the engine remembers the chain of scopes. So at the beginning, we'll look here, it won't find anything, then move on the second lexical environment, find the value of index and print the value of 0. In each iteration, it will have that chain of scope, and each index will be decoupled and it prints the right value. Being able to create a chain of scope, it's one of those reasons that make the language so functional. And to demonstrate it, I will create a function with the name getCounter. And within the getCounter function, I will set the variable of counter to the value of 0, and then return a function which pre-increments the value of the counter. So if I invoke the getCounter function, we get that function over here. And if I invoke it for the first time, we get the value of 1. If I invoke it for a second time, I get the value of 2. And then if I repeat it, I get the value of 3. This is because we managed to create a chain of scopes. So when we declare the function of getCounter, we created a lexical environment and we set the variable of counter and the value of 0. And when we declare the second function here, we created a new lexical environment. So in that function, we haven't declared any variables. So the lexical environment will be empty, but it will point to the nearest lexical environment, which in that case, it will be the counter of 0. And the counter lexical environment will point to the global lexical environment, which is empty. When we invoke the counter function, which is that bit over here, the JavaScript engine has that chain of scope, and initially it looks on the empty lexical environment. It doesn't find the value of counter. Then it moves on the second lexical environment, finds the variable of counter, pre-increment it, so it sets the value of 1 and return that value. On the second iteration, it repeats the same process and updates the value of counter, and the same applies for the third iteration. What we created here is a closure, and the definition of a closure is an inner function that has access to the outer scope of an outer function. So in that case, the inner function here, which has an empty lexical environment, has access to the scope of an outer lexical environment, which is the getCounter, and it can use the values within it. This was the end of this tutorial. We covered quite a few, but there are 3 key points that I want us to take away from it. So the first is to how we declare variables and how each declaration affects on scope. So using the var declaration, we said that we have a function scope. Using the let and const declaration, we said that we have a block scope. The rule of thumb that I follow is I set my variables using the const declaration and make sure that they are mutable. And if I want to update the value of it, then I will update the declaration to use let. I avoid using var since, as we saw, it has a function scope and this introduced a few bugs in our applications. The second point is to understand the meaning of scope. So scope is the area within a script that variables they are available, and in JavaScript this is implemented using lexical environments. Lastly, we can take advantage of scope to create a chain of scopes which lead us to closures. A closure is an inner function that has access to the outer scope of another function, and it heavily depends on scope. Having a good understanding in scope can help you implement closures very easily, which is one of those things that help developers to move into more advanced concepts. This was the end, and I hope to see you the next time. Thank you.